Too many of them.
We have a surprise patient at the RetroBlasting archive. A friend of mine, good friend of mine named John, came up to me. He found out what we were doing at RetroBlasting, restoring toys, and he said that he had his favorite childhood toy of all time broken by his son. Now, before I get into specifically what it is, I wanted to touch on one point. If you guys are out there, girls, guys, and you're, hanging out with your childhood toys and your children, and you want to share in that nostalgia, you might want to be objective at first. Take into account, is your kid Andy from Toy Story, or is your kid Sid?
You mean that happy child?
You'll know. And don't lie to yourself. You'll know if your kid's like really destructive with toys, or if he's, really cool with toys and, does his best not to break them. So consider that before you hand your toys over to your kids, because you're thinking at the end of the day you'll be able to put them back on your shelf and display them again, or keep them for posterity, but it doesn't always end that way. So just be careful. Now, this particular toy, my friend John is a huge fan of Star Wars and Robotech, and he loves fighters and aircraft. And so his favorite toy growing up was the Kenner B-Wing fighter from 1984. This one right here is John's, and it's already in pieces. And I took it apart. Because what happened was that John's son, this is my childhood B-Wing, and as you can see, it's still intact. The cool thing about the B-Wing is that the cockpit, just like in the movie, stays centered wherever you rotate the ship. But the B-Wing also, like the X-Wing, has an S-foil attachment where the S-foils rotate up and down on arms. It's a pretty cool design. The challenge here is that if you pull on these wings or force them, you're going to end up straining the arms underneath that the wings clip to hold the wings onto the ship. And unfortunately, that's what happened with John's, is that his son grabbed the wings and pulled, and when he pulled on the wings, he broke one of the arms that holds the wings on. Now let me set this down, and I'll just kind of show you in a close-up here what I'm talking about. He snapped this piece off entirely. And then to compound the problem, they used super glue to try and put it back together. I can't stress enough to avoid super glue on mechanical functions of toys. Don't do it, because when you do, that glue is not going to settle exactly where you put it. It's going to drip. It's not really going to hold anyway. There's no way that super glue or modeling glue is going to be durable enough to withstand the mechanical function of that wing going up and down all the time. And clearly it didn't. The only thing that was achieved by using super glue is that it went down through the hole where the arm comes up from into the mechanism. This is the gear mechanism, and I'll show you how this works in a minute, but it coated the inside of the ship. So when I tried to disassemble it, I couldn't get the ship apart because the wings wouldn't come up, because the glue inside had fused the entire thing together. So that's why I didn't disassemble this one on camera. I have a donor that we're going to disassemble on camera so that you can see how the B-Wing comes apart. And then we're going to cobble John's B-Wing back together from the donor and his original pieces. So let's get started doing the disassembly, and I'll walk you through the components, and then we'll look at next steps. The B-Wing fighter really holds a special place in my heart because it was the last Star Wars fighter I ever bought as a child. I bought it in 1985 on clearance at Toys R Us. My mom took me there to get me a toy before she took me to the allergist, where I got stuck with all sorts of allergy shots in this massive test. So I'll never forget being there in the doctor's office with my B-Wing pilot and my B-Wing fighter. So this is a special restoration for me on that level, although my B-Wing is intact and it doesn't need any TLC. As you can see from the three B-Wings here in this grouping, they tend to exhibit random signs of yellowing. John's cockpit, for example, is fairly yellowed on the top. Looks like it was kept out in the sun in that area too long, We're going to try and correct that with some Retro Bright in the next video. But what I wanted to show you now, this is the donor that I found. And as you can see, it's pretty clean as far as the body panels are concerned. Not a lot of yellowing, but it does have some awful black marker that's been done on this bottom side. I don't know what was going on here, like somebody was trying to paint battle damage on it. It's missing a lot of parts, so we can use the struts and some of the internals to fix John's. But the first step is getting the B-Wing disassembled, which is a real pill because the B-Wing is the most complex fighter toy Kenner ever made for Star Wars. So let's get started. You flip it over to the bottom, make sure that your landing gears are retracted so they're out of your way. Fortunately, this one doesn't have wings on it, so we don't have to pull the wings off. But if you were going to pull the wings off, there's a slot. It would have fit around like this, and you would have just simply firmly, but with a steady pull, just pulled the wing off straight, parallel with the body of the fighter plane. The B-Wing has a bazillion screws, so just get used to it and get mentally prepared. We're going to take out, I didn't even memorize how many screws are in this thing. There's a ton. They're all on the bottom, so I'll just start right here by the cockpit. The B-Wing was the second Star Wars fighter I ever dismantled as a kid, and that was a mistake. The X-Wing was simple to dismantle and then put back together. I found out the hard way that the B-Wing was not as user-friendly to a 7-year-old, and my mom barely got the ship back together for me. I almost had to junk it, but fortunately that didn't happen. The nice thing about the B-Wing is that the screws are easy to access. You're not going to be chasing them down. Some of them don't necessarily want to hit the ground, but we'll get them later. Now the screws on the end are crucial because they also hold the tail cannon assembly onto the ship. So make sure that all of these come out. There's 4 of them. Some of them are deep-seated. Now I have to be careful at this point because the B-Wing is comprised of tons of parts, and I want to make sure that all of the parts that are specific to John's childhood B-Wing do not get mixed up with this one. So I'm going to start pulling these parts off to the side, camera left. Alright, so there are the screws. Get this out of the way. Alright, now at this point, you're almost ready to split the halves of the fuselage, but there's one crucial step that you need to make sure you take. I'm trying to get these last screws out here. Before I start pulling on this fuselage, I'm going to activate the S-foil arms and get them rotated perpendicular to the main spar. The reason I'm going to do that is because now that I separate these halves, these will be out of the way and it'll just pull apart, theoretically. Okay, so gently, and there goes that last screw. Gently we're going to pull this apart, and as you can see, we pre-prepped, and that comes out nicely. And then be careful, you don't want to do this over a hardwood floor because this cockpit is now detached and you don't want it to go falling to the ground and cracking. Now you're going to find with the B-wing that the internals are very finicky when they're not under pressure on the fuselage. You can't really play with them all too much. Like for example, this is the main spring and gear mechanism that operates the S-foils when you push down the engine cowling, and as you can see I can activate it by rotating it, but it's not really snapping back into place because it doesn't have anything to hold it down. I had to manually keep it down in order to get it to pop back out. You can see the motor here where the sound effect is made. This is actually spinning up against a plastic reed that's attached to the cockpit, and I can show you that right here. The cockpit has this kind of plastic reed attached to it so that when they're mated up like so, the engine is up against that plastic reed and the gear spins and it makes the noise, much like the snow speeder and the X-Wing fighter. You can also see the long gray rail right here. This is actually the lever for the landing gears. And as you can see, everything's buried together. It's all very tightly packed. So it's intimidating at first when you take a B-wing apart because you're like, oh my gosh, am I ever going to be able to get this back together? I would highly, highly recommend that if you're nervous about this, when you take it apart the first time, when you take the fuselage halves off and you're at this stage, stop, get out a digital camera, and take a photograph or multiple photographs of exactly how everything is aligned. Because it is hard to remember, and even though it's trial and error, you might get so frustrated trying to put it back together that you feel like you're just gonna have to give up. So take photographs if you're nervous, and then proceed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to remove the rest of the components. First thing I always do is remove the landing gear on the far end because it's just attached to this spar. And just lift that spar up a little bit and remove the landing gear. It's only put on there by a little hook. So we'll set that this way. This first wing arm is sort of tucked underneath the rotator mechanism. There's a little slot for it, and you can just lift that out gently. This is the little piece that tucks underneath so that it gets caught and moves with the mechanism. This next section here, we have a choice of removing well, actually we don't have a choice. The next thing you have to do is remove the main spring and gear from the wing S-foil mechanism. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to compress the spring by grabbing the engine and this backstop, pressing slightly, if it works, lifting the whole thing up and out. This whole assembly does come apart. As you can see, the spring is now, if I let it go, the spring pushes everything off the far end. Again, if you're nervous about this, take photographs of exactly how the parts are oriented so that you don't forget how to put it back together. For our purposes, I'm not worried about it. I'm just going to remove this end piece and this gear and this spring and set it off to the side. All right, now that that's out of the way, this track can come out, and this track is what's keeping. Well, first what we can do is we can finally remove this landing gear assembly. That's the front or cockpit side landing gear or foot, and then here is the landing gear arm. This is the lever. When you look underneath it when it's completed, this lever sticks out and you pull, and it operates the mechanism. And then this little track will come out. This track and this gear work in concert to move the S-foils up and down on the B-wing. This is what was gummed up with glue inside John's X-wing or John's B-wing because they had tried to use super glue to repair the wing, and it had just sort of oozed down into the ship right onto the mechanical assembly. And that's not good because then I couldn't get the B-wing apart easily. Fortunately, I was able to finally wrestle it loose and not break anything, but the results could have been far worse. Alright, so at this stage, you really have a choice. You can pull this, this engine assembly up and out with the engine attached, always being careful to preserve these small black posts on either side of the front end, because you want those when you put it back into the ship. If these break off, you're going to be in a pickle trying to secure this before you put the ship back together. There's a little detail piece right here that goes on the back of the ship. I can show you on this one. It sits right here on the side of the engine, and it pops out as well. And then there is the final wing piece and the button that attaches or that activates the electronics. So these two are now out. There's one final piece to this ship that I will not remove. I never remove it from any B-wing. It's the battery compartment door. And the reason I don't is because the battery compartment door was just a plastic fold hinge. And as you can probably tell or know from your own at home, they're always ripped, cracked, and torn because this door wasn't designed to take a lot of punishment. This one is actually cracked on two ends. Mine is cracked on one. John's is cracked on one. But I just generally don't attempt to remove it because you have to then push this plastic part back through this tight channel, and all you're going to end up doing is damaging the door further. There's no need to take it off. I just leave it the way it is. But that's how you disassemble a B-wing, and it's a process I don't want to have to do very often because the B-wing is big and it's complicated, and the only one that I've heard that's worse than the B-wing as far as access is the Y-wing fighter. And I'm sure that will come up on RetroBlasting sooner rather than later. Now that John's B-wing is disassembled, the next steps are going to involve cleaning the ship and de-yellowing this cockpit assembly. The cockpit tends to have a lot of yellowing on B-wings from Kenner because of the nature of the plastic that was used right behind the seat. So we're going to attempt to de-yellow this with some RetroBrite in the next episode. Additionally, we're going to give the entire ship a good cleaning, but we're not going to be removing stickers on this one. John's vintage stickers are in great shape, and so we don't want to damage them or replace them with repros since it's not necessary. So we're going to leave those intact while we do the rebuild. So in part 2, you're going to see a de-yellowing, you're going to see us clean the ship, and then we're going to reassemble John's ship with new parts and make it as good as it was the day he bought it.